folks, welcome to part 10 of the Basic Impetus How to Play series. Yeah, and it seems to be doing fairly well. I'm getting a lot of positive feedback and I'm happy about that. Anyway, this is part 10, and what we're going to cover in this video is we're going to start getting into the basics of close combat, melee if you will. You might want to refer back to part 4, which covers movement, charging in particular, and of course look at part 7, which covers cohesion and damage rolls, so you got the basics of that going. But yeah, we're going to focus on moving into contact, charging, aligning after making contact, the direction of the charge. We're going to touch on the impetus bonus a little bit. We're going to give some good examples of charging and moving into contact. And everything in this episode is going to be focused on unit contact. Okay, you probably know this, but yeah, you can have multiple unit melees going on. But we're going to focus our attention just on the one-on-one unit combats for now. Okay, let's jump right into it and see what happens. So what is a close combat and melee, and how is it resolved and initiated in Impetus? Well, basically, any straight line movement into an enemy unit where the moving unit contacts with its front edge or either of its front two corners is said to initiate a close combat. Melee contact is made. Another way to initiate a melee is to actually activate a unit that's already in contact with an enemy unit. In which case, in both cases actually, we resolve the melee immediately then and there. An important point to keep in mind here, different than shooting, is that both sides during a melee resolution will be rolling dice. They'll be rolling their damage dice and testing for cohesion if there's any damage done at the same time. So it's a very interactive part of the game. And one thing we need to keep in mind, so as not to be confused in the rules, is that any movement that does take us into contact with an enemy unit is termed a charge, regardless of whether or not we use a charge bonus die to give us a little extra movement to our move into contact. So all movement that's into contact is pretty much deemed a charge. We need to remember 2 more points we need to keep in mind as well regarding charge movement and moving into contact and resolving melees. And that is the direction of the attack is important. And we're going to go into that later in this video, what the direction of an attack is and what it's defined as. And basically, it's what it does is it determines whether an attack is going to be a flank or rear attack, or whether it's just a normal frontal attack. Another thing to keep in mind is the impetus bonus that units have. And you can find this in the army lists under the particular units. Units without an impetus bonus of 1 or more cannot move into contact with an enemy. They can't charge. It usually includes skirmishers and troops like that. But it's important to remember if they have an impetus bonus of 0, they cannot move into contact with the enemy. It doesn't mean they can't fight in a melee. I mean, they can certainly be charged, but they just can't initiate it by moving into contact with the enemy. That's something we need to keep in mind as well. Now, one of the first things we need to do before we actually move our units into contact, charge, is to figure out the direction of the attack. Is it going to be a flank or rear attack, or is it going to be a frontal attack? And this can have a profound effect on the melee, so we need to figure this out before we even move. And how we figure that out is we basically prolong the front edge of the unit so that we create basically this 180-degree frontal area. Now, any unit that starts its charge completely behind this line, like this area here, this heavy foot will be completely behind it. When it makes contact, it will be considered to be a flank or a rear attack. Now, if any part of the charging unit is in this frontal area, like in the case of this heavy foot here, who's partially in the frontal area, the attack will be considered a frontal attack, so it won't be a rear or flank attack. So it's pretty easy to remember, and if necessary, just lay your straight edge down just to see what's going on. So where the charging unit starts is what we're looking at. So what are the effects of that? Well, for one thing, the unit receiving the attack from the flank or rear is immediately disordered right off the bat. Now, there are exceptions like Wagenburg who don't suffer the disorder, and there are some other units in particular army lists that might not suffer disorder either. Another effect of this, and we will go into this in the combat section, is that if this unit who has been flanked or attacked in the rear loses the combat that follows, it will be destroyed, routed from the table automatically. So yeah, that's how we determine what a flank and rear attack and what a front attack is in Basic Impetus. Another thing to keep in mind when you're moving your units is that there is no alignment in Impetus. What that means is that two units, when they come together, they cannot be perfectly aligned corner to corner, edge to edge. Where you make contact is where you make contact and end your move and fight the melee. So it's pretty much unlikely that you're going to end up with perfect alignments during a game. But if we look at an example here, we've got some heavy cav facing off against some heavy foot. And if we look at them, they are perfectly lined up. So that if I move forward in a charge move with this heavy cav, I am touching both of their corners with my corners, and my edge is completely touching them. They're aligned. Now, the rule is in Impetus is that whenever this does happen, we roll a d6. Odds, it shifts the minimum to the left. Evens, it shifts the minimum to the right to break up the alignment. So in that case, I move the minimum distance so that I'm no longer perfectly aligned. And that could be a couple millimeters, whatever you agree on with your opponent. So that's what actually would happen in a case where I charged and I was perfectly lined up. Now, what that means, basically, is that if there was another unit here, like in this position, he's in a position now to charge forward and make contact with this unit. So that's an example of what can happen. So there is no alignments, perfect alignments in Impetus. Now, once a melee is initiated and movement into contact is completed, it's time to actually resolve the melee. And there is a set sequence and how to do that. It's kind of similar to how shooting works. Same kind of mechanics are involved here. The first thing we got to do is find our VBU of the units involved, modify them by their impetus bonus, and we'll go into detail with that too as well. And then any other modifiers like tactical, situational modifiers. Once the damage dice are rolled, any cohesion tests are made for any units taking damage, and then we decide what the results of the combat is. Besides permanent losses, it could be a retreat for the side that loses the combat. There could be a pursuit move for the side that wins the combat. And there could also be a rout, where a unit takes so much damage from the melee that its VBU is reduced to 0, and therefore it's routed, which is basically removing the unit from the tabletop. Let's take a look at some examples of charging or moving into contact. Now, this first example here, we have some heavy cavalry. They want to charge, and they want to make contact with this enemy heavy foot unit. Now, my impetus is 2, so I can obviously move into contact. They're not skirmishers. The distance in this case is about 5 centimeters away. Now, the one important thing about this example is that we have to take note before I move that if the direction of the attack. And in this case, if we lay down our straight edge and see what the front is of this heavy foot, we can see that I am completely back behind the unit's front, which means my contact will be from a flank or rear attack. Okay, so I make my move. Move them straight ahead into contact. And I have to mark the foot as disordered because they're being attacked in the flank. Simple as that. At that point, I would immediately resolve the melee. Now, in another example, once again, I got some cavalry here who want to charge and make contact with this enemy heavy foot unit. Now, as before, the movement rate of these guys is 8. Well, if I measure that, I can see 8 goes about that far. I'm not going to be able to reach. So here's where that handy charge bonus die comes in. So whatever I roll on this for mounted troops is what I add to my normal maximum move, which is 8. Now, the distance away in this case is about 10. So I need to roll at least a 2 on here or greater to make contact. If I don't, I move as far as I can, and I am disordered. So let's see what I get. 4. So I definitely made contact, about 12 centimeters. So I'd make contact after about 10. I'd move into contact. And again, another thing to note here is that the direction of the attack was from the unit's front, as you can see. Now, if you remember earlier in our series, we talked about movement and movement of groups and how groups of units can charge together. Well, in this example here, we've got just that. I have 2 heavy cavalry units which are formed up in a group, and part of that group is this skirmisher unit. However, we're going to ignore them because I activated them separately during my turn, and they fired on this enemy heavy foot, causing some disorder. So they're done for the turn. But now I want to activate these two heavy cav units, and I want to charge them into contact with these guys as a group. I want to be able to charge them. Now, I can do that. Now, in this case, what's going to happen is this unit here of skirmishers will be interpenetrated during the charge. And again, you can interpenetrate units as normal with charge moves. So, how would I move this as a group? Well, they'd move their normal charge distance as normal, but we would be moving them together as a group. So, let's say I start with this unit. They're about 4 centimeters away. That would take them straight forward into contact with that enemy heavy foot right there. And that's where they'd end their move. Now, I don't resolve the melee yet. I have to finish moving all the units in the group before I can start resolving the melees. That's the difference. Now, this unit's going to do its movement. Now, I measure that, and it's about 8 centimeters, which is its maximum move. So I would put him forward into contact. However, I am interpenetrating this unit of skirmishers. And if you remember from the interpenetration rules, when you do that, the skirmishers are moved out of the way. I put my unit in position, and then these skirmishers would be butted right up against the back of the unit that interpenetrated them. So it would look like that. And at this point, since the group has finished its movement, its charge in this case, I would now resolve each melee separately in this case. This one, and then this one, these two units. Okay, folks, that pretty much brings part 10 to a conclusion. Basically covered the fundamentals of getting our troops into close combat and how that all works. I hope it was informative. In the next episode, we should be getting into more details, specifically with the tactical modifiers that involve close combat and the damage rolls. Maybe the terrain, and definitely a little bit more on the impetus bonus. And that'll be really taking us into the process of resolving a close combat. And we might even start detailing the value of coffee and caffeine to help us win our games. I don't know. It seems to help me. I think. I don't know. Probably not. But anyway, folks, I'll see y'all in part 11. Take care.